Timothy Carlson was a 15-year-old boy with an unshakable belief that small acts of kindness could brighten even the darkest days. Though life hadn't been easy for the Carlsons, their tiny house was full of warmth, laughter, and the strength of a family who stood together through every challenge. His father worked long shifts at the factory, and his mother took on sewing and baking jobs to make ends meet. Their Christmas that year would be modest, but Timothy knew it wasn't presents that made the holiday, it was love. One crisp December morning, Timothy trudged down the front steps, a bag of trash slung over one shoulder. His worn boots crunched against the fresh layer of snow. As he neared the curb, he glanced toward the house next door. The little brick home, once cheerful with window boxes of flowers, now seemed desolate. Its curtains had been drawn for weeks, and the snow on the walkway remained untouched. "That's Mrs. Finch's place," Timothy murmured to himself. He hadn't seen her in a while, and a knot of concern tightened in his chest. She was an elderly widow who lived alone, and though she kept to herself, Timothy had always thought she seemed kind in the brief exchanges they'd had. He remembered how she had once handed him a peppermint candy when he was younger, saying, "It's nice to be noticed by a young one." Determined to check on her, Timothy marched up to her front door and knocked. For a moment, nothing happened, and he almost turned to leave. But then the door creaked open a sliver, revealing Mrs. Finch's lined face. Her silver hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes pale blue and a little weary peered at him through the gap. "Yes?" she asked, her voice soft but hesitant. "Hi, Mrs. Finch," Timothy said, offering his brightest smile. "I live next door. I just wanted to see if you're okay. It's been pretty cold and I hadn't seen you around." She blinked at him, surprised by his visit. "I'm fine, dear," she said. Her words were polite, but her tone lacked conviction. "Just keeping to myself." Timothy hesitated, glancing past her into the dimly lit interior. The air inside seemed heavy, and he caught sight of her thin sweater hanging loosely on her frame. "It's really icy out here," he said, stepping back toward the walkway. "I could shovel for you if you'd like. It won't take long." "Oh no, I wouldn't want to trouble you," she replied quickly, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the door. "It's no trouble at all," Timothy said. "The shovel's in the shed, right?" After a long pause, Mrs. Finch gave a small nod. "It's behind the house." "Thank you, Timothy." As Timothy set to work, clearing the snow and chipping away the ice, Mrs. Finch lingered by the window, watching him through a gap in the curtains. His movements were energetic and deliberate, as though the task were more important than simply clearing a path. For the first time in a long while, a faint smile tugged at her lips. When Timothy finished, he knocked on her door again. "All done," he said cheerfully when she opened it. "Is there anything else I can help with?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, then admitted, "I suppose I could use some help changing a light bulb in the kitchen. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Of course, Timothy followed her inside, his boots squeaking against the hardwood floor. The house was colder than he'd expected, and the faint smell of stale air hung in the room. As she led him to the kitchen, he noticed the bare shelves and the sparse decorations, a single photo frame on the mantelpiece, and a dusty figurine of a little bird. Timothy swapped the light bulb quickly, but his curiosity got the better of him. "Mrs. Finch, is your heater working?" he asked, shivering slightly as he spoke. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's an old house, Timothy. The heater hasn't been working right for weeks. I've been getting by with blankets and a space heater, but it's not the same. Have you called someone to fix it?" She shook her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I can't afford that right now. Retirement isn't what it used to be." Timothy felt his chest tighten, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he nodded sympathetically. "I'll see what I can do about that. I'm no expert, but maybe my dad can help. He's good at fixing things." Before he left for school, Timothy made her promise to let him return the next day to check on her again. "You shouldn't have to deal with everything alone, Mrs. Finch," he said earnestly. She watched him go, standing in the doorway as the cold air swept through her house. Her heart felt lighter than it had in months, though she couldn't explain why. For years she had retreated into her loneliness, convinced that the world had moved on without her. But that boy, his smile, his energy, his willingness to help made her wonder if perhaps the world hadn't forgotten her after all. That evening, Timothy sat at the dinner table, poking at his bowl of vegetable soup as his parents discussed the day's events. His mind was filled with thoughts of Mrs. Finch, her quiet house, and her timid smile. "Tim, you've hardly touched your food," his mother, Clara, said gently. "Is something bothering you?" Timothy set his spoon down and looked at her and his father. "It's Mrs. Finch," he began. "I stopped by her house today, and I think she's struggling. Her heater's broken, and she hasn't been eating much. She seems so alone." His parents exchanged a glance, their faces softening. "I think she's been like that since her husband passed," Clara said. "I always meant to reach out, but you know how it is: work, the kids, life. It's easy to lose track of time." "Well, I don't think we can ignore it anymore," Timothy said firmly. "She shouldn't have to go through this by herself." His father, Henry, smiled at him proudly. "That's a good heart you've got there, son. What do you want to do?" Timothy hesitated. Then an idea began to form in his mind, a small seed of kindness that would grow into something far greater than he could imagine. The next day, Timothy bundled himself in his winter coat and headed to Mrs. Finch's house with a mixture of resolve and curiosity. His conversation with his parents the night before had only strengthened his determination to help her, but he also realized he wanted to understand her better. When Mrs. Finch opened the door, her face softened as she recognized him. "Timothy," she said, her voice less guarded than it had been the day before. "You're back." "Hi, Mrs. Finch," he said with a warm smile. "I wanted to check on you. Did the walkway stay clear overnight?" "It did," she replied, her lips curving slightly. "Thank you again. I didn't think I'd see the day when I'd have a neighbor so determined to shovel my snow." "Well, someone's got to make sure you're not slipping out here," Timothy said lightly. "I also wanted to see if there's anything else you need help with. I've got some time before school starts." Mrs. Finch hesitated but eventually nodded. "I could use a hand sorting through some old boxes in the attic. I've been meaning to get to them, but the steps are too much for me these days." "Sure thing," Timothy said, following her inside. The attic stairs creaked under their weight as they ascended. Timothy flicked on the light and found himself surrounded by stacks of dusty boxes, each labeled in faded handwriting. "Wow," Timothy said, glancing around. "There's a lot of history up here." Mrs. Finch chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it. Most of these boxes have been up here since my husband and I first moved in. We always said we'd sort through them together, but life had other plans." Timothy opened a box labeled Christmas, revealing a collection of ornaments, garlands, and a miniature nativity set. "Did you and your husband like decorating for Christmas?" he asked, holding up a glass ornament shaped like a star. "Oh yes," Mrs. Finch said, her eyes misting slightly. "David loved Christmas. He'd hum carols while we trimmed the tree. Our favorite was always Silent Night." She paused, her voice growing wistful. "After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to decorate anymore. It didn't feel right without him." Timothy set the ornament down carefully. "It sounds like you made some great memories together." "We did," she said with a small smile. "David was a kind man. He loved this neighborhood. He always said it was full of good people." Timothy wanted to ask more about her husband, but he sensed the memories were bittersweet, and he didn't want to push her too far. Instead, he moved to another box, this one labeled books. Inside, he found old hardcovers with gilded titles and well-worn pages. "You must really love reading," he said, holding up a copy of Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Finch's face lit up. "Oh, I do. I used to devour books when I was younger. I've read that one at least 3 times. Jane Austen has a way of making you feel like you're right there, don't you think?" Timothy nodded. I read it in school last year. I liked Mr. Darcy. He seemed proud at first, but he turned out to be a really good guy. Mrs. Finch laughed, her voice lighter than Timothy had heard it before. That's a good summary, Timothy. You have excellent taste. They spent the next hour sorting through the boxes, sharing bits of conversation as they went. Mrs. Finch told him about the trips she and her husband had taken to the coast, how she had once worked as a librarian, and her fondness for classical music. Timothy, in turn, talked about his love of soccer, his struggles with algebra, and his dream of becoming a teacher one day. As they worked, Timothy began to see beyond Mrs. Finch's quiet exterior. She wasn't just a lonely old woman, she was someone who had lived a full, rich life. Someone with stories worth hearing. When the last box was sorted, Mrs. Finch dusted her hands and looked at Timothy with gratitude. You've been a great help, Timothy. I've been putting off this project for years, but you made it easy. It's no problem, Timothy said with a grin. Actually, I was wondering. Would you like to come over to my house for Christmas dinner? My family would love to have you. Mrs. Finch's expression froze for a moment, and she looked at Timothy with wide eyes. Christmas dinner. Yeah, he said, shifting nervously. It's not going to be anything fancy, we're keeping it simple this year. But I know my mom and dad would love to meet you properly, and I think it'd be nice to have you there. Mrs. Finch hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of a box. Oh, Timothy, that's a very kind offer. But I don't want to intrude on your family's holiday. You wouldn't be intruding, Timothy said quickly. We've got plenty of food, and honestly, Christmas is better when you have more people to share it with. I think my dad's going to tell a bunch of bad jokes, so you'd actually be helping me by being there. Mrs. Finch chuckled, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. You're very persuasive, you know that. It's a gift, Timothy said, grinning. After a long pause, Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. All right, Timothy. If your family truly doesn't mind, I'd be honored to join you for Christmas dinner. Great, Timothy said, his face lighting up. We'll pick you up around 5, okay? Don't worry about bringing anything, just yourself. As Timothy headed home, he felt a sense of accomplishment and excitement. Mrs. Finch was no longer just a neighbor to him, she was someone he genuinely cared about, someone who deserved a little joy and connection this Christmas. And he couldn't wait to see her at their table, sharing laughter and stories with his family. Christmas Day dawned bright and cold, with sunlight gleaming off the fresh snow blanketing the neighborhood. Inside the Carlson home, the atmosphere was warm and bustling as the family prepared for the evening celebration. Though their decorations were simple, a string of colored lights framing the window, a small tree decorated with homemade ornaments, the house radiated cheer. Clara had been busy in the kitchen since early morning. The aroma of roasted ham and freshly baked rolls filled the air, mingling with the scent of spiced cider simmering on the stove. Timothy, eager to help, set the dining table with their mismatched plates and carefully folded napkins. Tim, make sure to set an extra place for Mrs. Finch, Clara said, glancing over her shoulder as she slid a pie into the oven. I already did, Mom, Timothy replied with a grin. By mid-afternoon, the Carlson family was ready. The house was spotless, the meal was nearly complete, and the tree sparkled in the corner of the living room. Timothy glanced at the clock, feeling a flutter of excitement. Time to pick up Mrs. Finch, he announced, pulling on his coat. Henry, already bundled up, grabbed the keys. Let's go, sport. We don't want to keep her waiting. When they arrived at Mrs. Finch's house, she opened the door with a tentative smile. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress under her coat, and her silvery hair was carefully pinned back. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Finch, Timothy said warmly. Merry Christmas, dear, she replied softly. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. I hope I'm not overdressed. You look perfect, Timothy assured her. As they walked back to the Carlson house, Mrs. Finch glanced at the glowing lights in their window. Your home looks so warm and inviting, she said. I can't remember the last time I celebrated Christmas with anyone. Well, that's about to change, Timothy said with a grin. When they stepped inside, Clara greeted Mrs. Finch with a warm hug, and Henry helped her with her coat. Welcome, Eleanor, Clara said, guiding her to the living room. We're so glad you could join us. Please make yourself at home, Henry added. Mrs. Finch's face softened as she took in the cozy scene. The tree twinkled with lights, and a plate of cookies sat on the coffee table next to steaming mugs of cider. Your home is lovely, she said, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. Timothy handed her a mug of cider and said, Come sit by the fire. Dinner's almost ready. As they waited for the final touches on the meal, the conversation flowed easily. Mrs. Finch told stories about her late husband David and their Christmas traditions. She spoke of the year they got stranded in a snowstorm on the way to visit family and ended up celebrating in a tiny roadside diner. It wasn't what we planned, she said, laughing softly, but it turned out to be one of the best Christmases we ever had. Henry shared his own tale of the year he tried to put together a toy kitchen for Clara and ended up with half the pieces left over. She's the one who finally figured it out, he admitted, grinning at his wife. By the time they sat down to dinner, Mrs. Finch's initial shyness had melted away. She marveled at the food spread before her, the glistening ham, the bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans, the golden rolls, and the cranberry sauce served in a chipped but cherished bowl. This is wonderful, she said, her eyes shining. You've gone to so much trouble. It's no trouble at all, Clara said with a smile. Having you here makes it feel special. As they ate, the room was filled with laughter and the clinking of silverware. Henry told his usual round of corny jokes, and Mrs. Finch laughed so hard at one of them that she nearly spilled her cider. Timothy beamed, seeing how comfortable she had become. After dessert, Clara's famous apple pie, Timothy stood and retrieved a small package from under the tree. This is for you, Mrs. Finch, he said shyly, handing it to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the gift, revealing a handmade ornament. It was a wooden heart painted with snowflakes and a banner that read, Your family too. Mrs. Finch's breath caught, and tears welled in her eyes. Oh, Timothy, she whispered, this is beautiful. We all worked on it together, Timothy said, glancing at his parents. We wanted you to know that you're part of our family now. Mrs. Finch clutched the ornament to her chest, her voice trembling with emotion. I don't know what to say. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years. You don't have to say anything, Clara said gently. We're just glad you're here. As the evening wound down, Timothy walked Mrs. Finch to the door. She paused on the threshold and turned to him. Timothy, you and your family have given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the feeling of being part of something again. I'll never forget this night. You're welcome anytime, Mrs. Finch, Timothy said with a warm smile. And don't forget your family now. As she walked back to her house, clutching the ornament in her hand, Mrs. Finch felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time since her husband's passing, she looked forward to what tomorrow might bring. And Timothy, watching her go, felt a deep sense of pride and joy, knowing that this Christmas had truly been one to remember. The days after Christmas were quiet, but they held a lingering glow of warmth for both the Carlson family and Mrs. Finch. Timothy couldn't stop thinking about how happy she'd looked during dinner, her laughter filling their small living room like sunlight through a window. She seems so much lighter now, Timothy said to Clara as they washed dishes together the day after Christmas. Like something's changed for her. I think you gave her something she's been missing for a long time, Clara replied with a smile. You reminded her that people care. A few days later, as Timothy shoveled snow from their driveway, he spotted Mrs. Finch walking toward their house. She was bundled in her wool coat, her scarf tucked neatly under her chin, and her gloved hands clutching a small parcel. Good morning, Mrs. Finch, Timothy called out, setting his shovel aside. Good morning, Timothy, she replied, her cheeks pink from the cold. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Timothy said, waving her toward the door. Come on in. Mom and Dad are inside. When Mrs. Finch stepped into the house, Clara greeted her warmly, offering a mug of hot cocoa to chase away the chill. Mrs. Finch settled into an armchair near the fire, holding the small parcel in her lap. "I wanted to stop by and thank you again for including me in your Christmas celebration," she began. "I can't tell you how much it meant to me. It was the first time in years I've felt truly happy." "We were so glad to have you," Clara said, sitting beside her. "And we hope it's the first of many," Henry added, coming in from the kitchen. Mrs. Finch nodded, her expression softening. "You all are so kind." "And Timothy," she turned to him, her pale blue eyes glistening. "You've been a blessing in my life. Your heart is so big, and I want to make sure that it carries you as far as you want to go in life." Timothy shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "I just wanted to help," he said quietly. "And you did," Mrs. Finch said. "Which is why I want to give you something." She placed the parcel on the coffee table and gestured for Clara to open it. Inside was a neatly folded letter and a small envelope. Clara glanced at Mrs. Finch, who nodded encouragingly and began to read the letter aloud. "Dear Carlson family, I cannot find the words to fully express my gratitude for what you've done for me. For years I believed I was destined to live out my days in solitude. Your kindness, your warmth, and your generosity reminded me that even in the quietest winters of life, there can still be spring. Timothy, you have a rare gift, the ability to see people, truly see them, and offer your heart without hesitation. That gift will take you far, and I want to help ensure you have every opportunity to achieve your dreams. Enclosed in this envelope is a check to start your college fund. I've been saving for years, unsure of what to do with it, and I can think of no better use than to invest in your future. To Clara and Henry, please accept the second check as my way of thanking you for raising such a remarkable son. Your generosity has given me more than a meal, it has given me hope. With heartfelt gratitude. Eleanor Finch. As a pal. Clara opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly, and gasped when she saw the two checks inside. The first was made out for $10,000 money for Timothy's college fund. The second, addressed to Clara and Henry, was for $2,500. "Eleanor, this is too much," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's exactly the right amount," Mrs. Finch replied firmly. "You all have given me so much more than money could ever buy." Timothy stared at the checks in disbelief, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Finch said gently, reaching out to place a hand on his. "Just promise me you'll use this gift to follow your dreams. And don't ever stop being the kind-hearted young man you are." "I promise," Timothy said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. Clara and Henry sat beside Mrs. Finch, each taking her hands in theirs. "You've been a blessing to us," Clara said. "This means more than we can say, but it's your friendship we value most." That evening, Timothy sat at the table with the letter in his hand, rereading it for the third time. The weight of Mrs. Finch's gift was heavy, not because of the money but because of the trust and belief she had placed in him. "She didn't just give us a gift," Timothy said softly to his parents. "She gave us a chance to keep making a difference." "You're right," Henry said, clapping a hand on his son's shoulder. "And I have no doubt you'll make her proud." That night, as Timothy went to bed, he placed the letter on his desk next to the ornament that read "Your family too." They were both reminders of the connection he had forged with Mrs. Finch and the way kindness could transform lives, including his own. The weeks following Mrs. Finch's extraordinary gesture were transformative for Timothy and his family. The checks she had given them weren't just financial lifelines, they were symbols of the bonds they had forged over a simple act of kindness. Timothy carried her letter in his backpack for weeks, reading it whenever he needed motivation. Mrs. Finch, now a regular visitor to the Carlson home, began to flourish in ways none of them could have predicted. She joined a knitting circle at the community center, reconnecting with old acquaintances and even making new friends. Timothy often found her regaling Clara with stories of her youth or laughing at Henry's unending stream of dad jokes. "You've brought life back into this house," Eleanor Clara said one evening as they sat knitting together by the fire. "And you've brought it back into me," Mrs. Finch replied with a smile. As the months turned into years, Timothy worked harder than ever at school, knowing that Mrs. Finch's belief in him wasn't something he could take lightly. Her generosity became the fuel that pushed him through tough classes and late-night study sessions. Every achievement, whether it was acing a difficult math test or being accepted into an advanced placement program, felt like a shared victory between him and the woman who had become like a grandmother to him. Mrs. Finch, in turn, took great pride in Timothy's accomplishments. She often framed his certificates and proudly showed them off to her friends, claiming, "That boy is going to change the world one day." On Timothy's 16th birthday, the family threw a modest celebration at home. Mrs. Finch arrived early, carrying a cake she had baked herself, its slightly lopsided frosting evidence of her still developing skills. "Happy birthday, my dear boy," she said, hugging Timothy tightly. "I hope you're ready for another year of adventures." "I'm ready for whatever comes next," Timothy replied, grinning. As the evening progressed, Timothy made an announcement that left everyone beaming with pride. "I've been thinking about what I want to do in the future," he began, glancing at Mrs. Finch. "And I think I've decided. I want to study social work. I want to help people the way all of you have helped me, and the way we helped Eleanor." Mrs. Finch's hand flew to her chest, her eyes misting. "Oh, Timothy, you'll be wonderful at it. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Years passed, and Timothy continued to pursue his dreams. With Mrs. Finch's initial gift and the support of his family, he earned a scholarship and enrolled in a university to study social work. Finch throughout his college years, visiting her often and sharing stories of his classes and internships. "You're doing amazing things, Timothy," she would say after every visit, "and I'll always be cheering you on." When Timothy graduated with honors, Mrs. Finch sat in the front row, her heart swelling with pride as he walked across the stage. By then, their bond had grown deeper than either of them could have imagined. She was no longer just a neighbor, she was family. Not long after Timothy started his first job as a social worker, Mrs. Finch passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news hit Timothy hard, but as he read the letter she had left for him, he realized that her presence would always be with him. "Dear Timothy, I may not be there to see all the wonderful things you'll accomplish, but I know in my heart that you will continue to make the world a better place. You've already done so for me. Never forget that the smallest act of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives in ways you may never see. Carry that lesson with you and you will honor everything we've shared. With all my love. Eleanor Finch." At her memorial service, Timothy spoke of how one Christmas dinner had transformed both their lives. "She taught me that kindness has the power to heal, to connect, and to change the world," he said, his voice steady despite the tears glistening in his eyes. "She believed in me when I needed it most, and I will spend the rest of my life living up to the example she set." As the years went on, Timothy became a dedicated social worker, helping families and individuals find hope during their darkest moments. In his office, he kept two mementos: the framed letter Mrs. Finch had given him that first Christmas and the wooden heart ornament that read, "Your family too." Though Mrs. Finch was no longer there to see it, her kindness lived on in every life Timothy touched. It was a legacy that began with a knock on the door, a shared meal, and the simple yet profound power of connection. And in that legacy, Eleanor Finch's spirit remained, proving that love and kindness are the greatest gifts of all.